Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies. Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we will be looking at a terrain project that I have recently completed. Now, it all began a couple of months ago in our COVID historical group, where Mr. Crew of Trimontium Hobbies posted a link to an order that he had recently completed with a load of peninsular terrain for kind of the Napoleonic era, and obviously with quite a large British peninsular army, I had to have some for myself. So I asked him kindly to put in an order for me from JB MDF Wargames, sorry, and the files themselves are from Miniatureland. Now, when we went to our big 100 Days finale weekend, Mr. Crew arrived armed with a massive box of terrain for me. So I was quite happy with my goodie bag, and I took it home and had a good look at it. Now, the terrain itself from the Farmstead is quite large, and it comes in a good variety of pieces. The doors are all separate, and there are holes drilled in that you can insert a pin or a rod through that allows them to open. However, I am incredibly lazy when it comes to terrain, so I was just going to glue mine in place. Now, looking at the terrain as well, it's got a good amount of detail. There's a trough for the horses to kind of go in the stables, so you can add kind of hay to it if you wanted to, just to add a little bit more character to the piece. And the interiors are well designed as well, so it could be magnetized or even just stacked as it is, in order to be able to take apart and have interior gaming. So it would be great for something like the silver bayonet, and it all kind of stacks together nicely, so you can just drop it down on the tabletop. There's a slight bit of cleaning up involved, but we'll get onto that in a minute. I started off by cleaning up some of the excess materials with a craft knife, just running the blade along the edges just to give it a smoother finish and remove any kind of larger noticeable kind of bumps or loose strands. Now, the main place for this was kind of around the overhanging areas, so like kind of the beams that are underneath the tiles and the back of the roofs and stuff, where with a FDM printer it's quite common for you to have the initial kind of like layers, especially overhanging areas that aren't supported, to kind of have a little bit of kind of separation and kind of excess material where it's kind of the weight has kind of pulled it down a bit. So you just want to clean that up with it, and it doesn't affect any of the detail. It's just a simple kind of drag your blade along just to remove the excesses. Just take a bit of care, and once you've done it, you kind of wouldn't even know that it was there. So just taking my time going around all the different pieces, just kind of giving it a good once over, and then kind of preparing for the next stage. I then took a lighter and kind of ran it all over the building just to kind of melt the stringy kind of webbing which you get with FDM prints back into the building, so it wasn't obvious, especially when painting, because that will add annoying kind of details to the miniature if you were to just paint over them and dry brush them. So I just melted them back into the building and then just kind of briefly went over them again if I needed to with a craft knife, just to remove them from the model. The next thing I did was to mark out a baseboard for the building to sit on. Now, this is a kind of personal preference of mine. I always like to have a fixed base plate, and looking at the way the model kind of goes together, there are obvious break lines which I wanted to fill in, but if you were to just throw these down as a piece of terrain on a table, they would look great as they were. So it's just a personal preference, these next steps. Once I had cut out the baseboard, I glued the first part of the building on with some heavy duty kind of all-purpose glue from, I think I used Gorilla Glue in this instance, and then I placed the first part down and then just made sure that whilst it was still wet that I could line up both of the buildings on the base plate with a good kind of border around the outskirts of them to give it a little bit more character to the piece. Now, obviously, a little bit of repositioning was involved, and using kind of glue that takes a little while to set, but still has a very good stickiness to it, allows you to kind of just move it around slightly to be able to get a better position rather than just fixing it straight in place. Now, the next stage is where the fun really begins. Now, I was just using regular filler for most of the part, but it can be incredibly messy. I started off using a spatula, and although it worked very well, I just decided that I'd get my fingers in there because I could reach more kind of closed parts to just kind of roughly smooth over and fill in any of the joining gaps. Now, obviously, with the ground cover in the courtyard, that's not really much of an issue because it's just kind of making a kind of textured kind of layer to kind of blend in the gap. But when it came to the walls, the interior walls I wasn't too worried about because I was going to be sealing them in anyway, but they needed to be done in order to kind of do the external walls, which were a little bit more difficult because of the angle of the kind of walls in places. So again, with the tool, it was quite hard, so I just used the spatula where I could. Otherwise, I would just put a bit on my finger and just run it along into the gaps themselves. Now, this wasn't perfect, but it did a much better job that when I could smooth it over with a little bit of water once it had slightly dried, or just get a little bit of sandpaper and sand it down, so that once the kind of base coat of spray was added to the building, it would be a lot less noticeable. And I was fairly happy with the result. However, when there was the kind of brickwork patterns involved, I used milliput instead, obviously just mixing it together and then popping it over the stone and then using a sculpting tool just to kind of recreate the blend in the brickwork. Now, my sculpting is not perfect, but I feel like this did a reasonable job. I also took this opportunity to fill in the trough in the stable area with some milliput and then kind of just scraping the knife over it at random just to kind of give it the impression that it was filled with hay ready for the horses. Now, this area is going to be covered by a roof, but it should still be visible to the to anyone looking at it, so I wanted it to kind of just give a generalized impression that the stable was in use. Once the milliput had dried, I then returned to kind of filling out the rest of the base area with filler, just to kind of blend the building into the board and give it a little bit of kind of definition in terms of it's not just going to be a smooth base plate. It's going to have a little bit of kind of bumpiness and rolling hills kind of aesthetic to it to make it blend in and look a little bit more realistic. At this point, I then added the doors and the kind of lintel bits above the doors before filling in the gaps again with filler using the same process. Before gluing the rest of the buildings in place, I undercoated the areas inside, just focusing on like kind of the interiors and the stable area that would be covered up with a dark brown, just to kind of avoid any kind of greys potentially seeping through in the light with the windows being open and visible. So just to give it a dark kind of enhancing effect, should we say. I then glued the layers down and the building was ready for a proper undercoat and basing as well. Now, before I paint the building, I am going to apply the basing materials. Now, I always start off with a kind of heavy kind of blobs, should we say, of kind of very small shingle stones, and I just apply this kind of randomly around the building itself in kind of little dribs and drabs. This just gives it a nice little kind of stony effect to the ground, kind of to break up just sand. After that has dried, I then apply normal kind of coarse sand to the remaining areas, just to gives it a little bit of definition once it has been painted, just to break it up, and you will see the result at the end of the video. Now, when I started painting this building, I wanted the process to be relatively straightforward, so I decided that I would do most of the work with rattle cans. So I started off with an all-over undercoat of Hyrax Brown from Colourforge, just to give a good kind of shadowy recess to the building, as well as kind of starting the foundation for the ground covering as well. Now, yes, I am spraying indoors. However, it is a well-ventilated kind of garage instead of a, like a living room. So I've taken necessary precautions for those of you that go, oh, you shouldn't be spraying indoors. This was the week that we had horrendous snow and I wanted to get this project done, so I took all the necessary precautions to kind of minimize the effects of spraying indoors. Once the initial brown had dried, I then focused on the wall areas of the buildings to kind of build it up to that kind of whitewashed, lime-scaled Mediterranean look that the Spanish buildings quite often have. So I then used trench brown again through a rattle can, just to dust the wall areas into like a kind of a lighter colour, before finally spraying a white bone from Colourforge over the walls again, just to make that white colour pop even more. Once the sprays had dried, it was time to start applying paint to the rest of the areas. Now, to begin with, I used a burnt umber acrylic poster paint from a thrift store, just cheap, because when applying basing I don't like to waste expensive paints, and the principle here was the same. So I thinned it down with water until I had the desired consistency, and then I applied it to all of the floor areas and all the stone, like kind of on the outside, the ground cover, as well as the using it as the base layer for the tiles. Now, because Mediterranean buildings have vibrant terracotta roof tiles, that's the image that I always kind of think of when I think of Mediterranean Iberian buildings. I then decided to dry brush up from that dark brown using a corn red to start getting that dark reddy undertones blending in with quite a heavy dry brush before kind of transitioning to a Bugman's Glow using a flesh tone, which might seem a bit strange, but I think that that kind of is a perfect bridge between the dark red and the vibrant orange that I want to use as the final step. So I used a slightly less heavy dry brush of Bugman's Glow over the tile areas before finishing off with a fiery orange dry brush over the top. Now this was a little bit finer than the rest as well, just a bit lighter in my application, just to kind of give it that pop on top. Now I like to blend all my buildings back in together using a wash, and that, so I deliberately made the final dry brush very vibrant, so that once it had been toned down, it would give me a much better kind of desired effect for what I was aiming for than bright orange. So it might look a little bit silly now, but going forwards, you'll see what I mean. Now, before I carry on with the building's details, I want to get the messy stage out of the way. So I will use a Talon earth or Talon sand to dry brush all the sand areas just to start building up to a brighter colour that Mediterranean soil kind of looks like. So I will heavily dry brush over all the sand with that before mixing up a black and white acrylic paint. Again, I'm using cheap paints for the initial base layers because it's such a large area, but they work just as well as the expensive miniature paints for this. So I'll put the grey kind of colour all over the larger stone basing material, and I will also use this as a base layer for all the stonework that is visible on the buildings themselves, as well as any kind of like hearthstones or kind of stone kind of patio looking effects under the doors. Once that is done, I will then dry brush all these areas with a dawnstone just to make that brickwork definition pop a little bit more, and the stones just to give it a bit more variation in tone. When it comes to the exposed brickwork on the buildings, I will apply a even lighter grey, in this case administratum grey, just to give it a much more varied tone, and as well as making those final stages pop a little bit more with the highlights when it comes to the wash and end result. Before we carry on with the final details, it's a good idea just to use a wraithbone to touch up all of the rendering on the buildings where we have been dry brushing, just so that we have a clean kind of overall coverage before we get on to using some contrast to pick out the final details. I'm going to use wildwood to paint all of the beams underneath the tiles, the shutters and detailing within the windows themselves, as well as any other wood features like the doors and the posts holding up the stables themselves. Now obviously I'm going to take my time with this, but any mistakes or overspills, just retouch back up with Wraithbone when necessary. Next I'm going to take Leadbelcher to paint any ironwork that is visible on the building. Now this will mainly be the hinges and decorations on the doors, so it was relatively quick to do. The final step before any washes and touching up is to use Zandri dust to paint over the straw area in the trough that we had sculpted earlier. Now to blend everything all together, I am going to use a thinned down wash of Agrax Earthshade to cover the entirety of the building. Now I've thinned it with Lamium Medium just to give it a little bit better consistency than water, and I'm just going to make sure that I move the liquid all around and to avoid any pooling, because really I'm just looking to stain the colours and blend it together. Now the final painting stage is an all-over dry brush of Screaming Skull. Now for this I use a large kind of painting brush that you would use to paint at home, just because I want it to be a fine kind of bristle but cover a large area. Now I will be dry brushing both the ground textures as well as the building. Now I do this to blend everything all together with a final kind of neutral overtone that will enhance the kind of overall effect, I feel, of the terrain piece. To finish off the terrain piece, I'm going to apply some static grass using some cheap PVA glue from a craft store, and then I will also add a variety of tufts, just making sure I use a little bit of super glue to put them in place, just to give them a little bit of a stronger hold on the board for gameplay. And then that is that. And now it's time for a final reveal. Now I'm fairly happy with how this terrain piece has turned out, and I have a couple of more buildings to do for this specific terrain project. A chapel first and foremost amongst them, and I've decided to just try out and put some gorillas around it just to make it look as if they're defending their plunder and their stores at the local farm from the dastardly French. And with that, I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.